Kierkegaard talks about a lot about the knight of faith. Is
Yeah.
the knight of faith more achievable or preferable as a role model than a Nietzschean Ubermensch, or are they actually closer in some sense than meets the eye?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and to whoever the audience member is that posted it, thank you, forcing me in the deep end of the pool. So I think it's important when we make these sorts of comparisons and contrasts and we read thinkers together, which I'm trying to do, right? I'm trying to maximally show the ways in which someone like Nietzsche and someone like Kierkegaard, ostensibly radically opposed, it might turn out that their opposition is nested in a underlying agreement that is in many ways more compelling. And I think this is important to do as a hermeneutic or an interpretive task, because we live in a society now, whether America or the UK or wherever, where radical division, polarization, extremism becomes the mode in which we are normally engaging each other. So I understand myself as not those guys, right? And that distinction is one that I think is detrimental to philosophical work. And I think it's also detrimental to any kind of faithful existence, regardless of the object of our faith. So I think it's important to say, Kierkegaard, the Christian, Nietzsche, the atheist, maybe their Christianity and atheism is at some level the less interesting dynamic than their existential orientation to what it looks like to understand perspective and investment in selfhood as this constant task, right? Again, doesn't mean that we ignore then the specifics of their directional existence. It's just that we don't have to immediately see opposition where there might be underlying agreement in really compelling ways. So when it comes to their idea specifically of the Ubermensch or the Knight of Faith, it's tricky because I think for both of them, these are ideas that work structurally in similar ways, where they are the name given to what it would look like to pull off the task they have described, right? So for Nietzsche, the task is, how do I reevaluate and transvalue all values? How do I overcome this history that I bear, he says, as a camel, rage against as a lion, and then no longer live in resentment of as a child, creating their own values, right? So for Nietzsche, the Ubermensch is the name for what it would look like to have an ideal towards which we strive if we somehow pulled it off. For Kierkegaard, the Knight of Faith is similarly the account given of what it would look like to idealize that towards which we strive in our task of becoming a Christian. The goal is to become a Knight of Faith in some sense, right? What's also interesting is not only are these structural targets of fulfillment for both of them, they are also importantly idealized in ways that they each resist self-identifying with. And what I mean by that is Nietzsche does not really describe himself as the Ubermensch. He has to invent Zarathustra to do so, right? Kierkegaard does not describe himself as the Knight of Faith. He has to narrate these ideas behind layers and layers and layers of pseudonyms. And the most important one in this regard is Anticlimacus. So when toward the end of his pseudonymous authorship, Kierkegaard is writing stuff about, so what then does it look like to really be a Christian? Not trying to become one, but be a Christian. He actually says, I had to create a Christian pseudonym, somebody who could actually claim to have achieved what I only am still trying to figure out. So for both of these thinkers, they effectively create pseudonymous identities to narrate what it means to become the thing in history. Now, why does that matter? Because I think both of them, if they, in their moments of honesty, both of them recognize that actually being this thing is really disastrous. And we see these hints in different ways. So I think Kierkegaard's more honest about this than Nietzsche, because Kierkegaard does say repeatedly even, that part of what faith is a constant movement. It's something that we are always making, right? So being the knight of faith is not something that you do and now you've achieved faith and you walk away or you get to retire, right? It's not like on Thursday at 3 p.m. in, Oxfordshire, I became the knight of faith, done, right? And he even frames his discussion of the knight of faith in Fear and Trembling with a little preface that says this. It says, the Greeks understood that faith was a task for a lifetime. Well, if faith is a task for a lifetime, what does it really mean to be a knight of faith? It means that you are constantly and ever more so invested in living faithfully, right? Not having achieved being the knight of faith. It's about, am I invested in faithfulness? And if so, then there's really good reasons to think that no one could ever say of themselves, I am the knight of faith, I pulled this off. And if we did, as Kierkegaard says under the pseudonym Johannes Climacus, he says this would be so unhuman a way of living, he could never recommend it to an existing individual. Because we would stop being existing individuals, right? So what does it look like to become a Christian? It looks like an awareness that the knight of faith is not this thing that's impossible and faithfulness is always too hard and we'll never know the truth and God's always beyond us. It's not that. That's just sort of nihilistic resignation. It's instead an awareness that, think about all relationships that are defined by love. I've been married to my wife 22 years. Well, it turns out that every day what it looks like to love her is to constantly want to love her more. Plato understood this in the Symposium, where love is defined as, in fact, something that never allows for full possession. That's why a philosopher is a lover of wisdom, not a haver of wisdom, right? The philosopher constantly seeks after, constantly desires the beloved rather than having it and being done. So Kierkegaard, I think, is honest and owns up to the fact that the knight of faith names this ideal, and what it looks like to live in light of that ideal is to live constantly into faithfulness. But it's not to somehow pull this off and be done, right? Nietzsche, it's a little bit squirrelier in Nietzsche because the Ubermensch has to pull off something in order to live into it, right? You can only be the Ubermensch when you understand that the death of God means that we have transvalued all values. We are no longer bound by these structures and we have lived into something else. And again, as a kind of hermeneutic epistemological issue, like I've described it, I think that makes tons of sense. As an actually sort of practical historical thing, which Nietzsche sometimes kind of sounds like the Ubermensch is, right? There will be this day 100 years from now, he suggests, where the readers will emerge that can understand what he meant, and then we will move into this great day. In some ways, it's those moments which we don't have to read as this like historical prediction of some sort of Ubermensch society, but it's the fact that he leaves that open that I think, again, makes it just so agonizingly hard to read Nietzsche in light of the history of National Socialism. Right? Effectively, they understood themselves as doing the thing he called for. It didn't work out so well. I mean, it's horrifying what it looks like to think you've pulled that off. So if we read Nietzsche instead more kind of toward his middle period rather than his later period, what you see is books for none and all, right? Which again sounds like Kierkegaard saying, come all who are heavy burdened. You see that the Ubermensch has nothing to do with overcoming someone else. It's always about dying to my own ego in a very particular way in order to allow my ego to emerge in a new way. Well, that sounds similar, without the egoism, sounds similar to Kierkegaard's account of dying to oneself. So yes, I think we can read these in connection to each other in really compelling, complicated ways. And yet, I think to collapse them into each other, sadly, could make the knight of faith start looking like Nietzschean egoism, which would be a disaster. And similarly, if we collapse them into each other, the Ubermensch would lose, I think, some of the complexity of the fact that Nietzsche did kind of act like this was something we could pull off. Now, I think his own life proves maybe not, right? Like maybe he set himself a task that was structurally impossible. Kierkegaard, I think, understands the impossibility of being the knight of faith. And that's where, when I say I think Kierkegaard's more honest about this, that doesn't mean that Nietzsche is still not tragically complicated, right? I think Nietzsche's telling himself that he could somehow make this happen to overcome his own physical weakness, his own exhaustion with life, his own frustration with Lou Salome. Like, he was able, I think, to sell himself a bill of goods that inevitably led to the necessity of no longer being able to function as a human. And Nietzsche himself kind of says this, though. The task of the Ubermensch, right, is to see how far we can go as a human from a beast to a god. Kierkegaard never wants us to be a god, right? That difference is a difference that really matters. And again, I think we don't have to read it to those complicated extremes, but it's important that we not forget that they exist.